I'm Julie Amacher. I'm talking with Daniel Hope. I'm so grateful that you were able to come by the studio today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
I know that you have a very diverse career. You are a soloist, of course, and you have dozens of recordings. You also serve as an artistic director, a music director for a couple of chamber orchestras. And then I'm looking and I'm seeing, well, how does he do all these other things? You took on the role as the president of the Beethoven House in Bonn just a couple of years ago. During COVID, I'll just point out, so I don't know how that transition worked for you. And then you're also the artistic director of the Frauenkirche in Dresden. And I'd love to know how all these things that you do just maybe kind of intersect. I'm guessing maybe they do, that there are connections between all of these things.
There certainly are connections, but it's all about music. I love music, and music defines my day, my life, the thoughts that I have. And playing the violin is the most important part of that. I just adore it. I've been doing it since I was 4 years old. But I also love to create programs. I love to present young artists. I love to celebrate music in its various forms. And it could be live music, it could be radio, it could be broadcasting, it could be streaming. And you mentioned the pandemic. That was a key moment for me, as it was, of course, for many people. But it gave me the opportunity to launch a streaming series from my home, which we thought would probably go on for about a week. And we had no idea it would turn into 150 episodes. And so music has always been the driving force behind the things that I do, and I'm just incredibly privileged to be able to do it at such a intensity.
I was thinking a little bit about your Hope at Home series, and one of the things I remember you saying was you had to do them, I think it was like at 6 o'clock or something, so you could get the kids to bed on time.
Yes, that's absolutely right. We were live every night, and 6 o'clock was a great time because, the show went for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then the crew would leave, and I could go upstairs and make dinner and bring the kids to bed. And we have two young boys, and it became a routine for us, but it became a lifeline because we were so lucky to be able to be creative in that time, making music, playing music, and yet we were reaching a global audience. And it turned out that this was a lifeline for many other people on the other side. And even now, a few years afterwards, I get stopped on the street by people who saw that series, and it meant something to them. And we did it to share music. I do believe that music is a fundamental human right, and it needs to be shared. And at a time where we were not allowed to be free and not allowed to express what we wanted to do, it was even more important. And I also decided very early on in that series that a house concert is about the guests you keep. And so I wanted to reach out to other musicians and give them the chance to come and play. And of course, it wasn't easy, and we had challenges. But somehow we managed to create this atmosphere and to keep it going. And we refused to give up.
The project we're going to talk about, your latest 2 CD set, is called Dance. And that was something you really got to dig into during the pandemic, even though you'd been dreaming of this project for about 20 years. Tell me how it finally came together. How did this dream finally come true for you?
Well, my first album that I made was back in 1999. I've been recording ever since then. And back in those days, I had these dreams of making an album about a certain idea or a theme. And I put together a dance idea. At the time, it was 400-500 years of dance music because I was fascinated by where that came from, what it meant, and how it had influenced people over the centuries. And I tried to find a record company that was interested to do it, and I couldn't. And so I put it on the back burner, and it disappeared. And every couple of years, it would resurface in my mind, and I would maybe try and see if there was somebody that was interested, and there wasn't. And this went on and on and on. And things changed. My career changed. The world changed. And I started to really record very prolifically, and for the last 15 years for Deutsche Grammophon. And so a few years ago, I had started the conversation again and brought up this old project. And there was initial interest, but I didn't feel ready now because so many things had changed. And so, again, it went back somewhere out there, and I started to research more and discover more music and more musicians and more forms of dance. And then in the pandemic, we were, it was forbidden to have contact, to move, and to dance. And when I went back into the concert halls after the pandemic, I noticed there was a change in audiences. People were absolutely intensively there with us because they'd missed that experience. And I noticed they were starting to move. We did an America album, and when we got to Duke Ellington and to George Gershwin and these other composers, people were getting up and dancing in the halls, which doesn't happen so much in classical concert halls. And that got me thinking, and I said, I think maybe this could be the time. And by this stage, 450 years of dance music had become 700 years, and 5 or 6 musical genres had become 12. And I'd met so many fascinating artists around the world from different genres, and so I thought this is the time to do it.
I was really fascinated as to how you put it together, too, because it's not chronological. Tell me how you decided to put together these 2 CDs and what you put where.
It was a big challenge because obviously a double CD, a double album, has a lot of music. And this literally goes from the 14th century to the middle or even the end of the 20th century. So I looked for connections, I looked for harmonic connections, I looked for storytelling, which I always do in my programs. So I looked for connections between the pieces. And in terms of the vibe, how would you connect one dance to another dance? As if I were literally dancing through this album. And that took, I would say, the best part of 6 months. It was also very challenging to decide the pieces we left off the album because we could have filled 10 CDs with dance. Dance is the most basic and the most historic connection between movement and music that there's ever been. It goes back thousands and thousands of years to the ancient Greeks, to the Egyptians, and even before that. So we had to decide a starting point, and then I had to know where it was going to go. And for me, the starting point was the first notated dance music, and that we found in the libraries and the archives of the British Library, Italian music from the 14th century. And that's for the first time people actually sat down and wrote it down. So I thought that's a good place from which to start.
And then you take us well into the 20th century, and there's some Duke Ellington on this recording, too.
Oh, yes.
Is that like a secret passion of yours?
Not even secret, actually. Duke Ellington, for me, I mean, he's one of the most crucial figures in 20th century music because he embraces so much of what music means to me. He was so ahead of his time. He was so up against the prejudice of the time, and yet he seemed to somehow manage it with a decorum and a talent that was limitless. It was Marcus Roberts, my good friend, who said to me, when he listened to Duke Ellington, I unfortunately never heard him live, he said, Duke Ellington's influence on me was immediate. And I know exactly what he means, because if you watch the films and you listen to him, you feel tremendous inspiration. So I just had to have a piece of Duke Ellington on this album.
Which might be a little unexpected. Are there any other unexpected surprises, you think, for someone who's putting this recording on and listening to it?
You know, there are works that are very well known. You know, we have great ballet music from Tchaikovsky, for example, from Swan Lake, and the more traditional options that you might think of when you think of dance. But then we have pieces that are lesser known. We have a piece called Orawa by Kilar, who's a Polish composer. This piece was written in the 1980s. This piece had the greatest success on our tour when we were playing it. It just brought the houses down. It's a kind of a minimalist folk dance that just keeps going relentlessly, and it has a tremendous energy, and the people seem to really respond to that. So every one of the pieces has its own story and its own journey, and I'm just thrilled that the way that people listen to music has changed to such an extent that an album like this is now possible. I think 20 years ago when I started, it would not have been possible to make an album like this.
Talk a little bit more about that, because I know that the whole concept process, like coming up with a concept, wasn't well received initially for you. What has changed that's allowing it to happen now?
I think that audiences are drawn to the idea of storytelling, and that musicians now, thanks to many of my colleagues, are willing to go on that journey with that artist. A recording is now a very specific and very personal dedication to an idea or to a theme. And when I started out, a young violinist had to do his debut or her debut with the Tchaikovsky and Sibelius concerto. That was the norm, and things have changed now. People are interested in I'd say beneath the surface, the second take, as it were. And I've always, every one of my 35 albums has been about that. But it took a long time for that to be accepted and to become the norm. And now everybody is into the idea of the concept album. And I think it's a wonderful way of shaping what you have to say musically and reaching an audience with whatever you want to say.
You had a very interesting start to your career. This unusual situation where your mother was working for Yehudi Menuhin. I mean, hello. And she was choosing between two very prestigious jobs, quite frankly, when you got to the UK, and just chose that one, which had to have made a huge difference for you. He then helped you find your first teacher,
Yes.
who was very unorthodox in the way that she did teach. And this does relate to this dance concept. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes, and I mean, the way you described it, it was as if, she had the option to basically go to any job she wanted. That was not the case. We arrived in England stateless and penniless. My father is a writer and was fiercely anti-apartheid, and we were kicked out of the country, and we were forced. I mean, we were told we could never return, and we ended up in England where he was unable to find work. It was really very, very precarious for us. But my mother had trained as a secretary and is highly, highly intelligent and engaging, and she managed to find a contact to an employment agency that gave very high-powered jobs out to secretaries. So it was thanks to her talent and her drive and her ability to never give up to even get that far. And then there was the option to go for the secretary to either Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist, or the Archbishop of Canterbury. And she had heard Menuhin when she was a kid in South Africa and had admired him and thought, this could be really interesting, but I don't know if I'll get the job. But she got the job. And the job was supposed to be only a part-time job of a few months, and it turned into 26 years. So without thinking and without asking for it, we were suddenly thrown into the world of music and into the world of Yehudi Menuhin, which was an incredible stroke of luck and privileged existence. And he was also the most generous human being who embraced children who were showing connection to art and music. He believed that music was a human right. And he said, let him play. I'll help you to make that happen. And, that's not something that happens every day. So I have an enormous debt of gratitude to him. And the teacher that he selected turned out to be Sheila Nelson, who was one of the greatest teachers of young kids. And her philosophy in the 1970s was a little bit unorthodox for classical players. She taught us how to improvise. One of the first things we learned was how to improvise, which again in classical music doesn't really happen. And so it gave me and gave us a freedom of expression. And it was probably my 10th or 11th year when I realized there are different categories of music, because the people that came to visit Yehudi Menuhin were an extraordinary array of musical cultures. It could be a Stefan Grappelli, or it could be Irish folk music, it could be Rostropovich, but it could also be gypsy violinists. And I was listening to this music as if it were just all the same, and I believed it was the same. In fact, I still do, really. But then when I turned 10 or 11, my violin teachers, my Russian violin teachers told me, well, you can't do that. You can't play jazz and you can't play folk music because you're a serious classical violinist. You have to play Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. And I was shocked because I didn't realize that there was a difference. I thought, why can't I do this and not do that? So I guess that is very much inherent in this album, Dance, because we cover a wide variety of genres, of styles of music, of improvisation. And over the years and the decades, I've got to meet amazing musicians who've encouraged me to go on and to learn their skills and to learn their languages, because really music is the ultimate universal language.
And this gets back to Duke Ellington. And
Yeah, it does.
speaking of improvisation,
Yeah.
you are, on this recording, you're featured with the orchestra that you lead, the Zurich Chamber Orchestra. And one thing that's unique about them is they stand when they play, which
Yes.
is really fun for the audience,
Yeah.
I think, to really see the motion that goes into the music making. How was that impacted when you were playing these dance pieces? What was it any different? Were they actually dancing maybe? What were you seeing?
That's a great question, and absolutely, it's very different. I do prefer to play standing, does the orchestra. Not just the string players, but even the wind players, we play standing up. And it gives a different dynamic, a different sound. It looks different. It's engaging. And as you say, music is about connection and it's about movement and being moved, no pun intended. And it's when you play this music and you feel the energy, of course you start to move yourselves, as does the audience listening to it. So it's a huge game changer, actually. Not every orchestra is willing to do it, but the Zurich Chamber Orchestra, I initiated it back in 2016 when I became music director. And now it's not even imaginable we would go back to being seated. And if you get to symphonic repertoire and a Beethoven symphony and everyone's standing, again, it's a totally different vibe. And I would encourage everybody to try it because it's a different view of music. You're much closer together because you don't have any or very few chairs. You're physically closer as well, which means the contact and the glances and the way in which you exchange signals are different. And so all of that goes into this musical experience.
The way the first CD opens up is kind of ominous. It's almost a little bit spooky. I mean, we have the Shostakovich Waltz Number 2, the Danse Macabre by Camille Saint-Saëns, followed by Dance of the Nights from Romeo and Juliet by Prokofiev. And when I first heard that, I was like, ooh, this is kind of haunting, and I love it. Tell me about why these pieces were the right way to start this whole recording.
Well, this is part of my fascination with dance is that, of course, you have beautiful music and you have very rousing music and popular music. But the whole idea of what dance meant throughout the ages is very different. And the Danse Macabre goes back to the Middle Ages, to the time where people believed that if you danced, you could ward off evil spirits or diseases. And that's exactly where the Camille Saint-Saëns macabre dance comes from, this idea of a nocturnal journey through the graveyards and the dance of death, basically. And that's one element, of course, of dance. There's the elation, there's rain dancing, there's the peasant folk dancing, there's the celebration, there's the marriage, there's everything in dance. But there's also this side. And I thought by beginning with a slightly more dark and perhaps haunting side, it might draw in the listener in a different way before it then opens up into the joy and the exuberance of, let's say, klezmer or jazz or swing or everything else that's on the album.
I love it. I just was like, wow, this is brilliant. It was so much fun.
Thank you.
As a violinist, you see a natural connection to dance. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, the violin theoretically was created in the 16th century by the Italians. Andrea Amati around 1550 is the one that said, I created this instrument. But actually, that's not completely the case. The violin goes back thousands of years before that, and no one knows exactly who created it. but we think it was probably somewhere in India, possibly in the Orient. And it went through this tremendous migration over the centuries until probably sometime in the 12th, 13th century, it landed up in the markets of Italy, where it then became integrated into culture. And then Amati picked it up and created his own version of it. And the only really reason that this instrument was able to travel was because it was small and mobile. You could put it on your back and off you could go. So violinists often became the driving force in communication of music. And from the 15th and 16th century, when ballet, for example, became part of Central European culture, firstly in France, Louis XIV was obsessed with dancing, and he wanted somebody to control that and to take care of it. So he introduced the idea of the dancing master. And the dancing master was always the violinist. The violinist would take the violin, he would demonstrate, he would play, and because he was mobile, he could stand up and he could walk around and move. He was not fixed to a fixed point. So therefore, the idea of this dancing master was installed in the violin very, very early on. And the same with klezmer. The families that traveled from different parts of Eastern Europe would take their violins with them and they would play their songs. The songs that the mothers would sing, the violinists would then imitate and improvise. So again, the violin had always a leading role in dance. Of course, you needed percussion, you needed backing up, as you still do. But the lyrical voice was provided by the violin. And the violin is very unique in that it can produce the lyrical sound and the singing sound, but it can also be the rhythm section. And it's one of those few instruments that straddles both worlds. And I think that's why it's so inexorably linked to dance.
You play an instrument that's been on loan to you for over a decade, I think.
Yes.
So it's probably become very much part of you. Tell me about this instrument. Why is it so unique for you?
So this is the 1742 Guarneri del Gesù. Guarneri del Gesù was one of the most famous makers, even though Stradivari now is still more famous. Del Gesù was really working in his workshop in Cremona. He was not as famous as Stradivari, and he didn't have as much time, or I guess he couldn't devote as much care to the instruments because he was not as well known. So his instruments, from a violinistic point of view, are not as perfect as Stradivari, which makes them, for me, even more interesting because there's an element of pure brilliance within them. And I was so fortunate about 12, 13 years ago to get a call out of the blue one day from a family who said they wanted to buy an instrument and they wanted to buy it as an investment because the prices of these instruments have just skyrocketed over the last 30, 40 years. And basically no musician can afford to buy one of these nowadays, let alone a young musician. But this family were willing to make this investment and said, if you can find the instrument that you want, we'll buy it for you and you can play it, which is an amazing offer. But it gave me the chance to really play some of the finest violins in the world, Stradivari, Del Gesù, Amati. And I picked this instrument up and I played 2 notes and I said, that's the one. I just knew it. It found me somehow.
Why? Why was it the one?
I think it was the way in which it gave me the freedom to do what I wanted to do. And I liken it sometimes to driving a car. If you get into a wonderful sports car, which is a tremendous feeling, and you get into, whatever it is and you're driving and it's fast and furious, it's a very nice feeling. But if you then have the chance to go into a Formula One car and you sit in that vehicle, you realize it's not a car anymore. It's an airplane. And suddenly you fly. And that's the only way I can describe it. It's not a car anymore. It's not a violin, actually. It's an entity which has no limit. Its power is limitless. The controls are limitless. And yet, if you drive it the wrong way, you crash and burn immediately. So it's a question of learning and feeling whether you have that connection. And with this one, I felt the connection immediately.
That's fascinating. Well, we're going to hear you play it in just a minute. Before we do that, though, as you were putting together this dance project, what have you discovered about yourself that maybe even surprised you?
you know, we took this project. It came out at the beginning of 2024, and shortly afterwards, we took it on tour, and we did about 15, 16 concerts around Germany with the program. And creating a program as an album is one thing, but playing it live for an audience is very different. And you can't play the entire program because it would have been too long. So you have to create a selection, and I like very much to talk to the audiences and explain the connections between the pieces. So I didn't really know if the live version of this project would be successful, if the people would react to it in the same way as they have done with the recording. And I have to say, I was so delighted and so humbled to see that the people absolutely took to it in such a warm and enthusiastic manner that I really thought that this was a project that had been in my head for so long, and then it comes out, and then it gets taken to the next level. And so it changed certainly the way I think about the presentation of classical music and the way in which I believe projects are possible. If you told me this 20 years ago, I would never have imagined one could have even created the project. I'd hoped one could, but I didn't know it would be possible, and then tour it and make a tourable version, and then maybe even dance to it. And on some of the concerts, we had live dances as well. Dancers come in and take that to the next level, because the music is so strong it doesn't necessarily need to have a dancer there, because it conjures up all the visions of dancing. But if you have a great dancer as well, it's just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. So it got me thinking a lot about the future of classical music, which is something that I love so deeply and I'm so passionate about. And I would love to keep doing it as long as I possibly can.
You're really great at telling stories about your pieces, especially live in concert. Would you share the story with us about the piece you're going to play for us?
Yes, I'd like to play a piece which is so closely linked to Ireland, probably like no other piece. And I'm very much part Irish. I have an Irish passport. It was the only passport that I had until about 5 years ago. My great-grandfather came from Ireland, and my Irish heritage is extremely important to me, and it's part of the next big project that I've been involved with, which is a new album which is going to come out in July called Irish Roots, which looks at the history of Ireland, 500 years of Irish music and history. And there's one piece which I think is linked to Ireland like none other, and that's Danny Boy. And it was the piece that my grandmother would always sing to me, my Irish grandmother. And my great-grandfather was called Daniel McKenna. He came from Waterford in Ireland, and I'm named after him. So when I play Danny Boy, it's a connection to the past, it's a connection to my family, and it's a connection to Ireland, which is a country that's really saved us. Because to get back to the beginning of our conversation, when we landed in England, we were only allowed to stay in the country for a finite amount of time because we didn't have citizenship. But because of the Irish connection, we were granted citizenship, and as a result, we were able to stay in England. So without the Irish, my mother would never have had the chance to get that job for Yehudi Menu, and I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. So I have a huge debt of gratitude to the Irish. It's the reason I've always kept my citizenship, and Danny Boy brings it all together.
Great, let's hear it. Oh, what a beautiful way to spend an afternoon listening to you play in our
Thank
own
you.
little private concert. And you spoke of this new recording, which I am about to open here
Yes.
live on camera, Irish Roots. And Daniel, you were telling me that this recording, which is coming out in July, allowed you to have some really interesting collaborations. Would you share a little bit about that,
Yes, I mean
please?
it's been a dream come true for me. Irish music is a very rich and wide field, but the traditional folk element of Irish music is, of course, the core and the basis of it. And for 20, 25 years, I've been lucky enough to know Lunasa, for me, one of the greatest Irish bands on the planet. And we had been thinking about maybe collaborating for literally 20 years. And then about 2 years ago, they rang me up and said, it's time. It's time for you to come on stage with us and play some Irish music. And so we started playing together. And I grew in confidence in terms of this music. And they let me into their world, which is such a perfect world. And so I'm very, very privileged that they're on this album for 3 tracks. And then we have musicians like Sir James Galway and his wife Jeannie, very close friends of mine. James Galway, one of my greatest idols growing up as a musician, what he did for music, for the flute. And he is, in fact, playing Danny Boy on this album. We're accompanying him in a beautiful arrangement. And he's now, in his 80s and still so full of music and full of love. He's also from Northern Ireland, and he's one of those musicians that believes in an island, not in separation and not in division. And, we're living in a very divided world and divided planet right now. And I think music brings people together, and it's brought us together for this album and many other wonderful musicians. I have the Air Ensemble with whom I'm here right now in St. Paul, some of the finest musicians that I know, who come more from the Baroque world and the classical world, but we've been playing Baroque music from Ireland on this album. So it's a very diverse mixture, and it's a representation of that beautiful country.
And we have some Turlough O'Carolan too, right?
Oh, we have lots of a Carolan. You couldn't have an Irish album without a Carolan.
And so does your violin then become a fiddle?
It does. And I mean, playing with Lunasa, I'm playing next to Sean Smith, who is the greatest fiddle player that I've ever heard. He even holds the title of the world champion fiddler. So, I was pretty daunted going up against him and trying to sort of play around these amazing sounds that he makes. But he's such a gentleman and so gracious. And he let me into his world. And so, of course, the Del Gesù becomes the fiddle, because how could it not? And folk music has been the center of traditional classical music for centuries. Bach and Telemann and Handel and many others, they were obsessed with folk music, and folk music always found its way into their compositions. And on this album you hear that, but you also hear the other way around. You hear how this cross-pollination took place over centuries. You hear Vivaldi on this album, the reason being that Vivaldi's 5th concerto was the most popular piece in Ireland in the 18th century. It was played at every classical concert. So we have that on there too, and at versions of his music that we found in Trinity College in Dublin that were arranged specifically for the Irish audiences. So there's so much behind the story of this fascinating country, and I wanted to try and to pay my tribute and my respect to Ireland.
And I'm also thinking back to your first teacher who taught you how to improvise.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself leaning into some of that as
I
you
did.
were?
I did very much. And you have to be very quick with these guys, because they're so ahead of the music and the structure, and they're throwing you curveballs all the time. But they're doing it with love and with real kind of inspiration. And I have to say, we recorded the tracks with Lunasa at Windmill studios in Dublin, which is probably one of the most famous recording studios in the world. It's where the Chieftains recorded. It's where U2 records. It's where the Rolling Stones have been. We were in the middle of Dublin in this quintessential, legendary place playing Irish music. And there I was with my 1742 Gwenaëlle del Jesu and Sean, the greatest Irish fiddle player in the world, and trying to keep up with them. And there's a great spirit of adventure in this recording, and it happened on the spur of the moment.
That sounds very exciting. I was thinking about Tessa Lark. Do you know who she is?
Oh, of course, yes.
So she does bluegrass
Oh, yes,
on
absolutely.
her fiddle, on
Oh,
her
yeah.
Stradivarius.
Yeah.
And so I love how you're kind of, breaking the mold, if you will, about
Well, bluegrass is one of my great passions, and I helped to run a part of the Savannah Music Festival for 16 years. And we had some of the greatest bluegrass musicians come and play. And on one or two occasions, I was able to go and join them. Mark O'Connor and Sam Bush, Mike Marshall. Again, they let me into their world. But with Irish music, I have a different connection because it goes back not just to my family, but it's music that's been around me all my life. And I needed somehow someone to give me that extra push to really go for it. And that was Lunasa. And I'm tremendously grateful, guys. A huge thank you, because it's not a given. To go into any ensemble that's that finely tuned and that perfect, you're terrified at the beginning because you're worried you're going to mess them up. And they were just like, come on in. The water's fine.
Yeah,
Let's
you had
have
a jam
fun.
session.
Let's have fun, and don't worry about mistakes. Just do it, and we'll take care of you. And that hasn't really happened to me before like that. So a big thank you to them.
Wow, that's an amazing. I love that whole idea that they took care of you.
Yes, they did.
Given everything that you've accomplished in your career, what a great feeling to know that you can still be in a learning mode, if you will. And
Every musician can and should be in a learning mode. I think, Yo-Yo Ma says that so many times. Such a consummate, amazing musician, and yet he's always looking to learn. And we do learn. We learn with our ears and with our hearts and our minds. And we learn in that we hear a phrase that we don't know and we react to it. And if you are lucky enough to play with musicians who are the finest at what they do, you can only learn from them. And the sharing of music, again, brings us back to that universal essence of what music making is.
do you have any plans to tour with the music on this recording?
Well, we've been doing some concerts in North America. We were now just in Montreal and Toronto. We're going to be touring quite a lot now in the next months back in Europe. I want to go to Ireland, of course, although I'm pretty terrified playing it in front of an Irish audience. But we're discussing that now, and of course, I'd love to come to the United States because there's such an Irish community and tradition here. So that would be the next on our list. So we're working towards it.
Well, keep us posted.
I'll do that.
And thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.